Hello, everyone, and welcome to How to Have Extraordinary Relationships podcast. And I'm delighted today to be here with Rosie Wilby, who's going to tell us everything about her world and her life. But let me just introduce her. I could go on forever because she does, as far as I can see, pretty much everything. She's a podcaster. She's an author of Breakup Monologues. She has been a musician, or maybe still is, an actor, a comedian, worked on Later with Jules Holland, has interviewed as a journalist, Stereophonics, Muse, launched her own band in Ronnie Scott's, and does all sorts of things, and is now writing a novel. And so I'm delighted that you're here, because I don't know how you have time to do all this or how you fit it all in, but you have a very expansive life. So welcome, and just love you to tell us a bit about you and what you're up to at the moment.
Well, hello, Lucy. We should mention that the reason we've met is that we were both on Women's Hour together recently.
Yeah, we were.
Yeah, which was rather exciting. And that's the nice thing about doing things like that, is sometimes you meet really interesting people that you're paired up with in a little discussion. So I'm glad that something interesting has come out of that, because it's always a bit nerve-wracking, isn't it, doing those big radio interviews? But it was great fun, and so I'm really glad to meet you. And yes, the reason I've managed to fit all of those things in that you've talked through there is really because now I'm quite old.
Actually, you're younger than me, Rosie, unless your Wikipedia page is lying.
No. But you know, I am in my early 50s now. So yeah, I've had a career as a musician, which you mentioned, and that probably is on my Wikipedia page. And I've almost forgotten about my career as a musician, because that is sort of back in my 20s. It is most of that happened in a previous millennium. And so, yeah, I've been a music journalist and an arts and culture journalist more broadly, and then got into comedy in the mid-noughties when my band all broke up, and people used to laugh at my between song stories, which were very self-deprecating. And so I entered a few stand-up comedy competitions around about 2006, found myself in the final of the Funny Women competition, which was then held at the Comedy Store, and various other competitions. I was in the latter stages of So You Think You're Funny, Amused Moose, Laughing Horse. They've all got funny names. And yes, so I thought, oh, well, I should give this a go. And I started writing my own shows that I took to Edinburgh and toured around the country, around the world a little bit. And then that led to me developing a trilogy of solo shows all about love and relationships and the psychology of love and how that works. And the final part of that trilogy was all about breakups. And primarily that show was about my own breakup story. And I always say that the sort of funny version of it is that I got dumped by email and felt much better once I corrected her spelling.
Terrible to be dumped by email. Terrible.
I know, how rude.
Well, it's rude, and we're going to talk about this because you and I both work in this area of relationships and breakups and love and all that. But yeah, rude. Anyway, sorry.
Rude. But anyway, what I was going to say is that then led to other performers and friends coming up after the show telling me their breakup stories. And so the Breakup Monologues podcast was born, and then also the Breakup Monologues book,
which for anyone who Joy of Heartbreak,
the Unexpected Joy of Heartbreak, if anyone has checked that out. And the book is pretty different to the podcast. The podcast is naturally very episodic, and it has different guests on telling their stories. But the book really shares a lot of my stories and my own personal journey with discovering all of this psychology, and really in a very sort of personal way working out what all the science of heartbreak means. And you'll find me going into actual kind of science experiments. Like there's a whole chapter about me participating in a sex lab, which is lots of fun. So you can sort of read about my personal quest really to conquer the psychology of heartbreak.
So what did you discover, for the people that haven't read the book and would like to pick the book up or just know more about this? What did you discover about heartbreak? Because we met because we were talking about what happens post breakups or post-divorce with friendship groups, and we both had a slightly different experience of that. So we can move on to that. But I'm wondering, what did you discover about breakups, apart from the fact they're painful?
They are. They are, aren't they?
Yeah.
But I also found that they provided an opportunity in a strange way too, hence the subtitle of the book, The Unexpected Joy of Heartbreak. And I found many people, particularly women, had unexpectedly found a breakup to be a catalyst for positive change and self-knowledge, growth, personal healing, understanding themselves better, going on trips and doing exciting things, new hobbies, new friends, new relationships, and actually making more active choices. Sometimes we can sort of fall into relationships and then fall into patterns within those relationships and fall into stories about who we are and the limits of who we are. So I do think there was this sense of a breakup potentially being incredibly liberating. But I'm in a tricky position because I sort of have this kind of love for breakups in a way and all that they can provide in this unexpected way. But I'm now, as I catalogue in the book, I'm now trying to stay in a committed relationship. And I got married a couple of years ago. But I do have this uneasy relationship with it all because I talk in the prologue about how staying together and breaking up are, I think, sort of two sides of the same coin. They're a sort of flick of a switch apart. You know, we often have those arguments where we go into it thinking we're going to separate after that. You know, I'm not happy. And sometimes something changes. Your partner says something that makes you believe that things are going to be okay. And they have listened to you and you stay together either long term or a while longer. And well, what's happened to me on more than one occasion is we have that discussion when I'd been thinking about breaking up with somebody, and then a couple of years later they dumped me.
Oh, someone once said, I can't remember who it was an actor, and someone asked him, what is the secret of your long marriage? And he said, we both wanted to get divorced at different times.
Exactly that. Yes, if you both want to get divorced at the same time, I guess you're going to do it, right? There's nobody who's going to talk the other one out of it. Yeah, and I think long-term commitment is really complex, and you know, I like to look at the universalities of how we love and recover when love has gone wrong. Although what I spoke about when we met on the radio program was my experience is very much coloured by the fact that I'm a gay woman and have primarily had all my significant romantic relationships with other women. And there's a certain sort of cultural, sort of, I suppose, code of conduct that has been the case in the lesbian community, whereby breakups of relationships tend to be quite conscious and sort of the conscious uncoupling type model long before Gwyneth Paltrow and so on. I'd say that lesbians pioneered conscious uncoupling long before she did.
I'm a trained conscious uncoupling coach trained by Catherine Woodward Thomas, and that all came into the milieu, as it were, because of Gwyneth and Chris. But actually, it's interesting what you were saying, which is that's, you know, it's great it's been named, but that you feel that the system of conscious uncoupling, which for me is uncoupling with grace and dignity and keeping the decency of your partner intact and all that, that you feel that was part of the lesbian community before it became a kind of thing.
I think in small communities it sort of has to be, you know, not necessarily just gay communities, but small geographic communities, small villages. You know, you're going to bump into your ex, so you have to do it with dignity and consciously. And yes, I know Catherine Woodward Thomas as well, and we've had correspondence, and I've met other conscious uncoupling coaches, and I do really think it's just such a great idea. It's just, yes, as I say, I think that sort of practice has been around for a while, but it wasn't necessarily given a name. And yes, I've got Catherine's book on my bookshelves as well. So yeah, it's great that we now have this way of talking about breaking up with that sense of compassion. And obviously also that the law has changed in this country and we have no fault divorce as well, which I know some of my friends actually, you know, particularly my heterosexual friends, perhaps if their male partner had an affair or something, they actually want to state a reason. They want a reason to be documented. So it's quite interesting looking at those different approaches that we have to breakups, and how, you know, even how you and I had these sort of different, slightly different experiences.
So when you were doing your book, did you notice there was a difference between same-sex couples and heterosexual couples? Because I sort of feel love is love, pain is pain, heartbreak is heartbreak. You know, I don't think there's any differentiation between, you know, whoever you are. Pain, you know, heartbreak is heartbreak, and love is love. But did you find a difference when you were doing research for the book and doing your experiments and looking at the science?
Well, to some extent, yes. And this really interests me because I think there are some subtle differences. Like you say, there are so many universalities about how we meet someone, how we're attracted to them, we fancy them, and we have all these exciting chemicals whizzing around when we first get together, and how when we break up, we're sort of going through a withdrawal process because we've become a bit addicted to our partners. And all those things are completely universal. It doesn't matter whether you're male, female, non-binary, or, you know, what the gender identity.
Or doesn't matter. Yeah, polyamorous, it's the same.
Yeah,
I think it's the same feelings.
Yeah, doesn't matter. So, but I do think there are more nuanced differences which go largely undocumented, because most of the textbooks that I was reading when I was researching, actually I've written 2 books, when I was initially researching my first book, which is all about monogamy. We may come on to that too, because you just mentioned polyamory. When I was researching the first one, I just thought all of those sort of slightly more academic, dry and dusty textbooks about love take this incredibly heteronormative stance. And even though a lot of what they say is fairly universal, as you suggest, it sort of makes this sweeping assumption, makes this disclaimer that, you know, we know some relationships are between a man and a man, or a woman and a man, or, you know, different types of relationships. However, we'll assume in our language that we use in this book that all relationships are between a man and a woman. And I do think there are differences which, you know, it's questionable whether those differences are about social conditioning or inherent biology. You know, it becomes a bit difficult when you're saying women are like this or men are like this. You know, we don't really know why. But we do see gay men in relationships behaving in a certain way, and lesbian women in relationships behaving in a certain way. And one of the most interesting things that got me into all of this, I'm really fascinated about it, was the fact that lesbians have this very, very high divorce rate. And when I first read that, I was like, oh, what's that about?
What is that about? That's fascinating.
And so we divorce at many times the rate of gay men, and also many times the rate of straight people as well, although it's hard to have a sort of comparable figure because same-sex marriage and divorce have been around for so much of a shorter time.
It is hard, of course.
But yeah, it does make sense when you look at also the heterosexual divorce statistics, because they are largely initiated by the woman in the partnership. Around 75% of them are. So if you think about it, if women are the ones who are like, well, I've had enough, I'm calling time on this relationship, which on one hand you could say, oh, you know, why are women, you know, kind of leaving relationships? How terrible. But then you could also say, well, that's probably because men are, you know, being a pain.
Yes, you could say that, couldn't you, Rosie?
So of course there are different ways of looking at that, but it makes sense if women have, you know, either the sort of capacity to communicate and say, look, I'm not happy anymore and I'm calling time on this, or they do have some kind of greater impatience with with a relationship. And I think there's some kind of argument for that, because we've been socially conditioned to think that women are the sort of, you know, the keepers of monogamy, if you like, the keepers of the home. And whereas experiments I've done, like in one chapter of my book, I participate in a sex lab. I think I've talked about this, but you know, it's really interesting how there's this sort of unacknowledged vastness to female desire and female sexuality, and actually there's a greater quest or thirst for novelty among women than we culturally and socially want to acknowledge. And so we do see female sexuality being far more diverse. So, for example, if you do one of the experiments I did where you're, you know, looking, it's very strange experiment. It's very unsexy, really. It's not very arousing to sit in a funny little booth with, you know, some kind of funny electrode inside you or whatever. But you know, you're looking at images of men and images of women, and what they find is that women
images, or you're just looking at naked images. What images are you looking
sort
at?
Of well, I was looking at images of people masturbating.
Yeah.
And they're sort of measuring your arousal, your pupil dilation, and so on.
Interesting.
But they generally find that women seem to be aroused by everything, whereas men tend to be just aroused by the sex that they say, they declare they're interested in. There's more of a connection between their publicly stated sexual preference, their sexual identity or orientation that they've sort of declared or already sort of publicly labeled, whereas women have a much broader sexuality than they sometimes culturally acknowledge. I mean, for me, it was very eye-opening and interesting, because I sort of started to acknowledge that I'm more bisexual really than I thought. You know, I do sort of find men attractive. It's just in a romantic sense, I tend to find I'm more drawn to women.
Yeah, fascinating. Fascinating. So I really like this discussion, because obviously I see a lot of couples as a therapist, and they bring all sorts of issues. But one is this very traditional idea that the man wants lots of sex and the woman doesn't. And I'm not a sex therapist, but I do a lot of work around what do you mean by sex. And we were kind of going off piece, but it's very interesting about what a woman feels is intimacy isn't necessarily full on, full blown, penetrative sex where everyone then has to orgasm. They're much more interested in stuff that's, you know, whatever, all sorts of different things. So that I really hear, but I'm also interested. And so couples say, always ask me, how do people stay together? And I'm like, literally, really, it's two people just kind of decide they're going to stay together. They're like, we're going to stay together, so we've got to work it out. If the bottom line is we've got no choice but to stay together, so unless one of us has done something completely awful, like gambled all the money, where it has a second family, we're just going to have to work this out somehow, because we can do that, and we're grown-ups and we're committed. How does that feel to you? Because you're saying that you've done, you know, you've kind of got this thing about, I've got this breakup stuff that goes on, but actually you're married. Does it feel different being married? Is it like, well, I'm married now, so that's a commitment?
Yeah, how honest shall I be? I am not comfortable with being married, which is something that is obviously is difficult for myself and my wife, you know, and I don't want to sort of be too get too personal about it, but there is a tension, and there was around the time of the wedding, about what that wedding and that commitment meant to both of us. Because for me, falling in love and being with somebody and committing is the important stuff. You know, for me, I still attach probably a greater emotional significance to our anniversary, as I used to celebrate it, as in the anniversary of our sort of first date, when we first met and we first set eyes on one another. That will have, and some people say, oh, this is a terrible thing to say, Rosie, how dare you? That will always have more emotional resonance for me than the day we signed a piece of paper. I believe marriage is pretty transactional. I think of it more like a business contract, but I feel terrible saying that, because I know my wife does find it more romantic than that. And and we do argue about it, about what it means. But it doesn't mean that the relationship doesn't mean anything. But I don't necessarily think that marriage should mean anything. I mean, it can mean, of course, it can mean stuff if it means stuff to you. But I think it becomes problematic because marriage has a lot of baggage. Marriage is historically very patriarchal, and of course, we're changing it. The face of marriage, the way it looks, is changing, particularly now two women or two men can get married. But I still do have a slightly problematic relationship with it. And I was one of the people arguing that maybe everyone should be able to get civil partnerships as opposed to marriages. I thought it was interesting when there were heterosexual couples who wanted to have a civil partnership and not a marriage because of what marriage kind of symbolizes and embodies. So I do think it's all incredibly interesting. But going back to what you say about often in couples, the woman doesn't, in inverted commas, want as much sex as the man. Often what I've found in anonymous surveys or in stories that people tell is what is actually happening is the woman doesn't want sex with that man. She wants sex with somebody else.
Yeah, or yeah, yes, or she wants that man maybe to think about sex in a slightly different way. I mean,
That's
I think
true.
what's difficult is that people find it very hard to talk about. They find it very hard to say, look, actually, every time I kiss you, if you try and shag me, it's like being with a terrier that's trying to shag my leg, and it's it's kind of very interesting, and it's so I keep myself separate to you.
Yeah, I mean, it is different in relationships between women. We're often falling over each other not to be predatory, not to objectify the other person. But in a way, you've got to, right? I know there's a line in, am I allowed to swear?
Yeah, of course you are.
I mean, so there's a line in my first book where I say it's really difficult when you want to fuck women, but you don't want to fuck them over.
Yeah, I mean, not everyone's conscious. Not everyone behaves well, I imagine, in all relationships.
Yeah, but it's really difficult. And so, yeah, I mean, in relationships between women, again, I've joked how nobody ever gets anything started, because culturally that's sort of you're expecting the boy to ask you to dance at the school disco. You're expecting the man to sort of to do that. And so I've joked that
that's changed. I think that's changed.
It totally has. I mean, I think straight women call the shots a lot, actually. But I do think it's funny in relationships between women. I've sort of joked that we need a man to come and tell us that we're allowed to
How
kiss.
does anyone get to how does anyone get together then if someone sort of go, oi, can I have your number, or let's have lunch, or can I take you out, or
yeah, I mean, I know tons and tons of bisexual women who say they really, really want to have a relationship with a woman, but they just always end up in relationships with men. Firstly, because there's just loads more men around, particularly men who are interested in women, than there are women who are interested in women. But also, it's just really complicated because women for ages do this sort of friendly kind of, oh, let's have lunch, yeah, let's have a coffee, oh yeah, quite like you. And of course sometimes some women are great at that stuff, and I take my hat off to them, but I've always been really almost too respectful, and there have been opportunities that have gone by the by because I've been too maybe too respectful of someone's boundaries and imagined that she has more boundaries than maybe we're really there.
So you would just sort of, I don't know, go up to someone and say, I really fancy you, can I snog you? I mean, I might do that.
But
then I'm like, you know what, I'm of a certain age now.
I wish I could do that. I've been rubbish at doing that because I often fancy women who are not gay, or certainly historically I did when I was at school and at uni, and you don't know who's gay because nobody talked about it then. And so you know, there's this idea of how you have sort of set up a template in early life, don't you? So I think for a lot of young gay people, their template was somebody who's completely unavailable because you had a crush on someone who was completely straight and who would never think of you in that way. And so gay love was sort of categorized as this sort of tragic love. But that often played out in reality in your real first crushes. So it is quite hard to then move on from that.
Yeah, no, I can understand that's quite difficult. I mean, have things changed a lot, do you feel? Because obviously, you know, there's marriage and, you know, all sorts of stuff is different. Maybe people can, I hope people feel more open. Maybe, I mean, I hope they do. What do you feel it's changed a lot?
Oh gosh, yeah, of course the world is really, really changing. You know, and I've had so many straight female friends say they loved my book and they've loved reading about all the complexities of being two women together, because they always thought that, you know, being in a relationship with a woman would be so much easier.
Everyone says to me, God, I really wish I was in a relationship with a woman. And I'm like, what makes you think that would be necessarily easier? I think people feel it will be easier because there's a common, yeah, there's an assumption there's a common experience, but that's not necessarily the case.
No, it's really, really not necessarily the case at all. And so I do sort of gently, in my comedy material, I gently lampoon the women who come up to me and say that, say, oh, I wish I was a lesbian. It'd be so much easier. It'd be so much easier. And I always say, oh, but, you know, have you tried scissoring? Which is my sort of jokey response, rather than go into some of the sort of politics of how difficult it's been in many ways before we had you know, equal rights. But yeah, it's just so interesting, and like you say, I think so many things are universal. And yeah, I've been really interested in this sort of the parallels between love and addiction, and how it really is very similar, and how we're just getting addicted to these chemicals that person provokes a release of, you know.
I think that's fascinating. Tell us, yeah. So people come and say, I can't seem to stop myself. I'm talking about a heterosexual couple, let's say, from going out with that bad man. Yeah, we want to go out with a good man, but every time I see the bad man, every part of me goes, zing.
Yeah, I know. Well, yeah,
So what
yeah,
that feels like a chemical reaction. That feels like what
it
you're,
is. Yeah, it is totally. And something I look at in the book, there's a chapter called My Chemical Romance, which I look at some of the potential future of chemical interventions into our love lives, and whether we would or not in the future maybe take an anti-love drug. There's this neuroethicist I know, Brian Earp, who is looking at this idea of whether we would take a pill. So almost a little bit like what the two characters in the film Eternal Sunshine of the Spotless Mind do, where they go to this spooky company to have their memories of their partner erased because they're heartbroken and they want to move forward in their life. So would we take a pill that would in some way reduce the trauma, or would that sort of not help us psychologically? Would we repeat old patterns because we wouldn't have gone through that pain, which, you know, I spoke at the beginning about how breakup can be quite useful in terms of reflection and growth and healing and thinking about what you actually want and making more active choices. So that pain can be useful, but if we could just say take a drug to sort of dull that pain, would we not get the benefits and the understanding?
yes, because I mean, breakups have a pain. I mean, I always say to people, listen, it hurts like hell now. In a year, it won't hurt quite as much. In 2 years, it won't hurt as much. So, you know, it's a period of time over which the pain will gradually subside, but it is an opportunity for growth. But a lot of people find that quite difficult, and they rush headlong into the next relationship because they don't really want to feel the pain. So that's really the same as taking the pill. It's like, I don't really want to do the work. I'm just going to rush into the next one.
That's true. I mean, I even know one of my most kind of serially monogamous friends who jumped from one breakup into her relationship with her now husband within, you know, you could possibly even count it in hours, probably about 48 hours. but
No.
but she is a psychotherapist.
Yeah, well, we're all mad psychotherapists. Fascinating. Yeah, fascinating. So we're looking at it's so interesting. So you're now writing, you've done this and you've discovered all sorts of things about breakup. So there's that Japanese art kintsugi, I think, which is, you know, vases get broken and then you mend it with gold. So I think it's right. I think women are better at going off and doing a little bit of work on themselves and thinking, well, I don't want to keep going out with rogues or whoever all the time. So what am I going to do about it? Men in my experience don't tend to go that way, but I'm older and maybe the younger generation do. Did you find there was a generational shift at all when you were doing the research?
Yes, I mean, I do talk about kintsugi in my book. In the conclusion, I talk about how those breakages can make us more beautiful and, you know, a more wonderful partner for someone to have and to be with in the future. It's that idea, isn't it, that sort of gold paint that fills the cracks in the broken pot actually makes it a more valuable artifact. And I think that absolutely applies to a human who's had a few breakages and has managed to repair themselves, because that is a great feat of emotional maturity and intelligence, to be able to do that and to be able to communicate better. I was a terrible communicator in relationships. Even though I was a comedian and I was communicating on stage, you're sort of communicating in sometimes in a somewhat flippant way, and you're turning everything into a joke, which can be you know, it can be healing and it can help you through something, but it can also be a defense. So, you know, I've been able to deconstruct that a bit. So as much as my books are about relationships and how they work, they're also a little bit about comedy, how comedy has both helped and hindered me and my sort of career journey and my creativity, and how that has played a role in my healing and personal growth and understanding as well. Yeah, it's it really is. It is so interesting, isn't it? How this stuff all works. But I totally agree with you that we become more interesting, I think, as we get older. And it's such a shame that in society we're sort of less visible, particularly as women, as we get older, because I think we're, you know, midlife women are amazing and so powerful and wise.
Very wise. So what's your novel? Tell us about your novel. This is going to, what's it about and how are you finding it? And is it different to writing Breakup Monologues? What's happening?
Well, I mean, it is different. I mean, in some ways it's not completely different, because I am in taking inspiration from my real life, which obviously my two non-fiction books do. However, I'm then creating a story. I'm taking some real emotional experiences and experiences I've had on the comedy circuit and creating and performing, you know, and I think many first-time novelists do use their own life as material, as comedians do too. So, you know, I have got a protagonist who was a musician and is now in the comedy world, and it really is looking at complicated relationships between women, particularly when we're in competition with one another in male heavy environments, and how we behave, and particularly how we behave when we become romantically involved across a sort of privilege gap. So yeah, it addresses ideas around identity and sort of privilege and identity politics, and yeah, awareness of our own states of agency and relative states of agency in the world, and the sort of conversations that I think I wish I'd had with some women that I've sometimes been involved with, where I've not necessarily come out of it very well.
Yeah. Well, that's part of growing up. It's kind of growing up as thinking, well, I didn't handle that very well, or maybe, I really love the idea of this novel. So is it going to be funny? It's going to be funny, and it's going to be thought-provoking.
Well, yeah, I mean, I would say my non-fiction books are probably funnier, which is interesting because this novel is set in a comedy world, but it's got that sort of slight darkness. At the moment, I'm selling it as it's like a sort of queer version of Normal People, Sally Rooney's wonderful book.
Oh, wonderful, yeah.
With a bit of Baby Reindeer thrown in. The sort of not quite as dark as that went, but it's got a little bit of that darkness about performing and that sort of world, and how addictive it is, and how we can behave, and how we can be quite vulnerable in that world and not sometimes practice good self-care in a very intense world like stand-up comedy. So it's a bit of a Normal People meets Baby Reindeer.
That sounds wonderful. That sounds fantastic. That's ambitious, but it also sounds brilliant. It's mixing two wonderful things.
Well, that's a bit, I mean, you can never completely describe something because it's me, it's my thing as well. But yeah, if people want the kind of funny Rosie Wilby, the two non-fiction books certainly have lots of my sort of kind of Louis Theroux sort of awkward bumblings at sex parties and and stuff like that.
So how can people find you if they wanted, where can they find you on social media? Where would you like people to connect with you?
Well, I'm on Instagram, which was at Breakup Monologues is where I am there. I'm also on Threads. I'm not sure if many people are on that, but I am on there too.
Okay, yes, I'm not on Threads. That's passed me by.
Yeah, I'm still on the older X thing for now.
Yes.
At Rosie Wilby. I'm also on TikTok as Rosie Wilby author.
Oh, I'm not on TikTok. I've got to have a look at that.
Yeah, I don't do loads on there. Instagram's probably the main place. But obviously, if people just wanted to get in touch by email, if they look at rosiewilby.com, they can email me. But I really hope people will look at the Breakup Monologues book.
Yeah,
and it's available on Amazon and all the usual places. Hopefully you might post the link or something.
I don't seem to be able to manage to know how to do that yet, but I will share the podcast with you. We could post the link. Really don't know how to do that.
Yeah. But what was I going to say? And it's worth noting, if people like listening as opposed to reading it, I narrated the audiobook version of both of my two books, the Breakup Monologues and the first one, which is called Is Monogamy Dead?
Ooh, great titles. What do you think? Yes or no?
It's complicated. You've got to read the book. I think it needed a bit of reinvention and reframing. I think the old version of monogamy might well be dead, which was sort of full of assumptions about what monogamy is, or what even sex is, like you were saying earlier.
Yes, that's right. So monogamy is like that we meet and then that's it for the rest of time. And I mean, for a lot of people, and now that is like that's a very outmoded model. But people don't like it when I say that. Well, like it's pretty outmoded.
Oh, it's pretty, yeah. It's definitely pretty outmoded. But that's a whole other conversation. But if people want to hear me talking more about monogamy, there's my TEDx talk online, which is called Is Monogamy Dead? There's my Radio 4 thought piece is still available, A New Currency of Commitment, that's called. So there's all kinds of bits and bobs.
Yes, we can find you all over the place. Wonderful. Yeah. There's so much we could talk about, but it's really fascinating. Yes, buy the books, listen to everything, find Rosie, and you'll get a lot of information and thought-provoking things that makes us all like, I was thinking, oh, that's interesting. There's lots of interesting things you've done and said, and you've had a wonderful life. So thank you for being on the podcast.
Thank you very much.